Prime Minister Mark Carney's trip to strengthen European trade and security ties is now over, and Conservative leader Pierre is already panning the results, accusing Carney of signing phony declarations while failing to make progress on projects at home.
It's more liberal show business rather than getting it done. And I would say, don't confuse activity with achievement.
Carney's international trade minister is also on a trade mission to Brazil and Colombia right now. So are these trips really diversifying trade away from the U.S. or just distracting from those crucial American negotiations? Maninder Sidhu is the Minister of International Trade, and he joins me now. Nice to see you, Minister. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, JP.
So we're hearing U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc left Washington today after meeting with his American counterparts. We're hearing he's leaving a little earlier than planned. What have you heard? How did those talks go?
Look, as you know, JP, the U.S. is an important trading partner, and Minister LeBlanc is leading those conversations. And we'll continue to be at the table to make sure we get the best deal for Canadian workers and businesses. Those conversations are ongoing, but I think it's very important that Canadians know that we're fully engaged on that file.
How would you describe the talks this week?
I would say they're constructive. From what I heard, it's important that we continue to talk through many of the challenges, but it's important that we continue to be at the table, and that's what Minister LeBlanc is doing.
So you're in Brazil, and Canada is, talking about this Mercosur agreement, something we've been trying to negotiate for a long time. Mercosur being Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. The talks started, I believe, in 2018. After your trip this week, is Canada any closer to getting a deal with the South Americans?
I would say so. I think, look, it was in our platform commitment. It's what Canadians have given us a strong mandate on. It's what Prime Minister and President Lula talked about at the G7 about Mercosur, about more economic collaboration. And I'm here to follow up on those conversations. I recently, just 2 days ago, I met with the foreign minister here to talk about, with Minister Pierre, about the next steps. And we did do an announcement on making sure that we're able to lead discussions in October on Mercosur. And so there's a lot of ambition. It's a lot of good energy. Today, I'm at FIESP, which is an organization that represents 40,000 industries here in Brazil. And the mood is very positive, and the business community wants to see more. There's a delegation that's come with me from Canada, and so we'll continue having those conversations. But I am very positive that we're heading in the right way.
What are some of the stumbling blocks? Why has it taken so long to put pen to paper on an agreement with Mercosur? Why haven't we been able to deliver to this point?
Well, I can't speak for previous administrations, as I wasn't a minister back then, but what I can speak for it now is we're in a different environment. As you know, global trade winds, people want to deal with Canada, a reliable, stable trading partner. And so that's what I'm hearing across the globe. And so here I am in Brazil to make sure that we're following up on these conversations. And the mood is good. The mood is up, is really in the right direction. And I think when you talk about sectors, we have technology sectors, aerospace, defense, IT, infrastructure. There's so many sectors here that I'm showcasing with Brazilian partners. And, when you talk about partnership, it's not about competition, it's about collaboration. And so one example I'd like to give you is Porter Airlines, buying 75 Embraer planes, which have Canadian-made engines made in Montreal, Canadian-made landing gear, and by Canadian workers. And here in Brazil, the plane is made by Brazilian workers. So it's about collaboration to make sure that we're able to make sure to, in order to support industries and sectors on both sides in Canada and Brazil, but really sitting down with the governor today. We sat down with the governor of Sao Paulo, a state of 40 million people, so the size of Canada. And we sat there and talked about some of the things that Canada can offer, and the business delegation had joined me at that meeting. And so I think myself as a trade minister, I've been given a mandate by the Prime Minister to really showcase Canada and diversify our trading partners.
Conservative leader Pierre was critical of you and the other ministers who are traveling around the world trying to get trade agreements. He says 170 days into this government, you have nothing to show for it. He says, quote, this is all liberal show business. He says, don't confuse activity with achievement. I could go on. There was a lengthy list of criticisms he made today. What do you say to the Conservative leader, Minister, about what you're up to?
What I would say to Canadians that have given us a strong mandate to diversify trade is we've been hitting the ground running. Myself as trade minister, a little over 100 days. I started off in Ecuador to finalize the conclusion of that agreement. Afterwards, the FIPA agreement with the UAE, making sure we're having active discussions with them. But of course, in Paris, meeting with over a dozen trade ministers. In the past, what we've heard is Canada needs to be seen. We need to show up. And so here we are in Brazil. And as you know, the Prime Minister in Europe, yesterday they did a good announcement in Germany around critical minerals. It's important that we show up to talk to our partners around the world at a time when there's a lot of uncertainty, global uncertainty, and businesses expect us to be there at the table.
As you know, China has hit Canadian canola seed with a punishing 76% tariff in retaliation for the government's tariffs on Chinese EVs. That's caused a lot of pain on the prairies, as you know, Minister. The price of canola has dropped off. What can you tell us about any progress on getting these Chinese duties removed?
Yeah, that's an important sector for our economy. I sat down with the canola farmers, the growers, the producers, the sellers a little while ago. I'm meeting again with them tonight. And I think it's important that we continue to engage with China. Not too long ago, I sat across the table with my counterpart, Minister Wang, to talk about ways we can work through some of these challenges. And so the JETSI Commission, which has been going on for about 50 years, was an avenue to work through these challenges. And it sat dormant for the last 7 years. And so now, yesterday, they had their first meeting at the officials level. And I think that's what it's about. It's about having constructive, pragmatic dialogue to make sure we're able to work through these challenges. And that's exactly what the business sector, what the farmers expect us to do.
As you know, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has been active on this file, rightfully so. There's a lot of canola farmers in his province. And he says that Canada should remove the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to try and clear this logjam. Is that under consideration? Would the government consider getting rid of those tariffs on Chinese EVs?
Look, I respect Premier Moe. I think it's important that we all row in the same direction about standing up for farmers, standing up for important industries in this country, and we'll continue to engage on this file. And that's exactly what I've committed to do. And that's exactly what Prime Minister Carney will do. He's talked to his counterpart. And the first step was to make sure that we're able to have dialogue and constructive dialogue. Be it that. So I think, with the JETSI Commission back online, we're going to be able to work through a lot of these challenges.
To Poilievre's earlier criticism about how there is not a lot of progress to show for some of these trips, some of these negotiations that are ongoing, I take your point that it's about meeting people, it's about starting these relationships from scratch in many cases. But when you look through some of the announcements from this week, you look at the one with Poland, they talk about support enhanced collaboration, encourage mutually beneficial strategic partnerships. There's a lot of kind of flowery language, if you will, and there's not a lot of concrete announcements out of this week. Even on the critical minerals ones you spoke about earlier, not a lot of details there, not a lot of timelines. There's no money in these announcements. There's no talk of an actual project getting off the ground. What do you say to people who are frustrated about the pace of change when it comes to negotiating some of these new deals?
Look, on Mercosur, we want to move fast. That's important. We have an opportune time where people are looking at Canada as a stable, reliable trading partner. And I think it's important that we jump on that opportunity. My number one goal is to make sure that I open every door of opportunity. Meeting with the Chamber of Commerce across Canada, they have asked me to be out there to showcase Canadian technology, Canadian innovation, because as you know, Canadians, we're very modest. We don't brag enough. And other countries are taking advantage of that. And so we need to make sure that we're more aggressive, more ambitious. You spoke about critical minerals. It's important that we engage with like-minded partners. And Prime Minister Carney being in Europe now, I think this is his third visit. It's important to showcase what Canada has to offer. Critical minerals, energy. We talk about LNG. I was in Kitimat, BC to thank the workers that helped build that plant. Thousands of workers came together to build that LNG Canada plant. And that's a milestone for Canada. As you know, JP, that was the first shipment outside of the US market. And so, it's about economic security, but it's also making sure that we're promoting Canadian products on the world stage. And that's exactly what we'll continue to do. And that's what businesses and workers want us to do.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Maninder Sidhu, the Minister of International Trade. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for coming on. Prime Minister Mark Carney has wrapped up his 4-day trip to Europe. While he was there, he announced new commitments with Poland and Germany to expand our trade and defense relationships. But Conservative leader Pierre isn't buying it.
Mr. Carney has been frantically jetting around the world doing photo ops and signing phony declarations that are unenforceable and have no money attached to them. But in 170 days, he doesn't have a single project underway. He still doesn't even know what projects he wants to build, or how he's going to build them, or which companies are going to do the building. So what I think you're going to see from Mr. Carney is more big promises without any action.
Earlier, I spoke to Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, who's one of multiple cabinet ministers in talks abroad this week. I asked her about that reaction.
Never did we hear him that we should get to 3.5% of defense budget. Never did we hear him talking about the fact that our armed forces should get a pay raise in order to recruit better and to make sure that we could support our strong men and women. Never did we hear that we should increase defense procurement to make sure that we build more in Canada. Never did we hear from him neither the fact that ultimately we need to be less reliant on the US to become closer to Europe, and that's exactly what we are doing.
It's time now for the Power Panel. Michelle Cadario as Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin here with me in studio. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties, and Jordan Likeness is a former NDP strategist. Hi guys, nice to see you all. Thanks for coming in. Michelle, I'm going to start with you. We're hearing that U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is leaving Washington earlier than planned. He was supposed to be there until Thursday. That's not happening at this point. What's your take? Is that a bad sign that he's leaving early after meeting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick yesterday?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to read into this at all. It could be that they advanced the agenda faster than they thought it would. It could be that, that the U.S. administration is distracted on something else. And so, I don't think that the one thing I would say is he didn't leave in a huff. He didn't leave abruptly. It was just a bit of a shortened trip. So I'm going to remain positive that things progressed. I think we all know that ultimately the president has to figure out what he wants to do in terms of Canada. And ultimately, it's going to be him deciding what kind of deal we're going to strike and when it's going to be, because that's just the way he's doing business with absolutely everybody, and Canada is no exception.
Yeah, Tim.
So,
go ahead.
No, I was just that I don't think that Minister LeBlanc is an incredibly even-keeled person who doesn't get ruffled in any way, and he certainly would never kind of do anything discourteous to his hosts, and so I'm sure he finished his business and decided it was more productive to leave at that point.
Yeah, Tim, it's not necessarily all bad news that he left, because a source was telling us that the meeting was positive that they had yesterday. It ended with, I like this one, prudent optimism. That's how they're characterizing
How very
it.
Canadian. It must have been a Canadian source.
They're coming up with all these new euphemisms for how well things go. Prudent optimism. And they're saying that there's some technical work that has to be done now between the two sides, and it doesn't make sense necessarily to have another in-person meeting between Lutnick and LeBlanc. What's your read on this early departure?
And Dominic LeBlanc will get a King Charles Coronation Medal for spending that much time with Robert Lutnick as well, or Howard Lutnick, excuse me. Look, I'm with Michelle on this. Like, who knows, right? We don't really know where things are. Whether he stayed an extra 6 hours or he left 6 hours earlier, it probably in the greater scheme of things doesn't mean much. I tell you though, JP, what is interesting, and I've seen it from one source, that being Post Media. There seems to be somebody pushing out a story that Ambassador Hillman, who you've had on this program, who I think people view as eminently qualified because of her past involvement with the administration, could be a hurdle here. I don't know if that's nonsense, a distraction, or not, but it's interesting that, again, personality is rearing its head in this discussion, because you will remember the fire-breathing criticism that the president had of the former Trade Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Again, we're starting to see some of this pop up again. From where, from what sources, I don't know, but All I would say to that is it does seem to be fairly or unfairly that personality matters in this. I think in Dominic LeBlanc, to be fair to Dom, he is of the right disposition from the cabinet side. I don't know if Ambassador Hillman is rightly being targeted or not, but somebody's doing it. Be fascinating to find out why.
At least that vitriol is not being directed at Prime Minister Carney, though, from the
Correct.
president, right? That's a plus. I mean, what was the last thing we heard from Trump? Carney's a nice guy. They're going to get
No, it's nice. It was nice.
Yes. Jordan, what do you make of this early departure? Do you think we should read the tea leaves on this one, or is it just meh? It is what it is.
I think it's really tough to read the tea leaves, but I would say I think on the scale of positive statements, I guess prudent optimism falls somewhat under constructive. So maybe,
yes.
I think it's interesting to see because these readouts are now so carefully attuned in terms of what's happened. Look, I think that the challenge for the Carney government on this is that the buck and the decision-making clearly starts and ends on Donald Trump's desk. And he is so unpredictable and so mercurial. The talks could be progressing very well with Lutnick, and in the end, that may not make much of a difference. Yeah. That's a real challenge in these negotiations. The other thing is that it's been 5 days now since Canada unilaterally removed a number of the counter tariffs that we had put in place in an attempt to deal with some of the things that the U.S. has said are irritants. But of course, as Tim has brought up, there's always now new other irritants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge for the Carney government is that there's now been a number of decisions that have been made that have clearly been made in an attempt to offer a give to the U.S. government to advance these talks, but there doesn't seem to be any advance. So the challenge is now, has there been too much give? Have we lost leverage? Or are they going to be able to show some progress? So I think that's really what we should be watching for in the next few days.
Yeah, at some point they have to deliver something too, right? I mean, there has to be some goodwill shown. Michelle, let's talk about the Prime Minister's European swing. Let's pivot to that. You heard the opening clip there from Pierre Poilievre. He says that Carney accomplished very little with this trip. The government, you've heard them too. They're saying, well, at least we're opening up new trading relationships. At least we're having those conversations. What's your assessment of this Euro swing?
Well, he's doing what he said he was going to do. And what actually Canadians expect him to do. We need to broaden our alliances. We need to strengthen what we're doing with Europe, and we need new markets for our goods. And so I'm not sure if Pierre Poilievre has just never been party to a deal, but these things aren't done in a week. They aren't done in 10 days, and they certainly aren't done in 24 hours when you kind of touch down into a country. It takes time, and it also takes a lot of political runway as you build those relationships out to be able to come up with these kinds of agreements. And I think that Mark Carney, since his first days in office, literally his first days in office, has very much said, listen, I'm looking to Europe as new markets. I'm looking to them as allies that we can count on. And when we're talking about retooling the Canadian economy to try and get through this crisis and take our dependence off the United States, we have to look somewhere else. And Europe is a market of 460 million people, about the same size as the United States. And so it sure looks like somewhere that we would want to get more Canadian goods sold over there.
Yeah, Tim, Pierre Poilievre was saying there's nothing done in 170 days. And I thought, well, 170 days isn't that long, really. I mean, I could, if it was 1,700 days, maybe there's a point to be made. But is there something to be said for Poilievre's point that Carney's, swanning around Europe or whatever he described it as, and he's coming back with not very much to show for it? There's talk about enhanced collaboration, encourage mutually beneficial strategic partnerships. There's not a lot of meat on the bones here, right, from this European tour.
Yeah, look, Pierre Poilievre is doing what opposition leaders are supposed to do, right? He's building a narrative that has worked for the Conservatives before of how the Liberals are, elites who like to jet to Europe. So he's going over ground that's been well treaded before. Sure. He doesn't have much else to go after right now. It's important for him to do that, I think he would think politically over time. So that when he does face Mark Carney in an election campaign, he will go back to the line, he's just like every other Liberal. I would say, JP, the most fascinating thing of this European trip is how Mark Carney has taken his motorcade and driven all over Justin Trudeau's previous views on LNG. And you're not going to hear Pierre applaud him for that, though I suspect they share a perspective there that Mark Carney is big on LNG, big on the opportunities that many in the East Coast see on LNG, whereas Justin Trudeau, I believe it was 2 years ago or so, said there wasn't a business case for it. That's a big deal. That's a big change by Canada. And to be fair to the current Prime Minister, if you're a business leader, a proponent, you're looking at that saying, all right, well, 2 years ago, one guy said not a chance. Now there's a guy saying a chance. What do I do? So that's an area where Pierre does have to be a little bit careful as somebody who, to be fair to him, has been a proponent of the LNG industry. So he's got to watch the opportune politicking with the reality of business groupthink.
Yeah, Jordan, actually, Tim Hodgson, the Natural Resources Minister, was also quoted in a Bloomberg report today talking about the potential for LNG, and he's saying, unlike the previous Canadian government, that closed the door to LNG exports, Prime Minister Carney's government has opened it. There's definitely been a shift on natural resources in particular. I had the Polish ambassador on this week, I had the German ambassador on this week, and both kind of smirked when I asked about LNG and Trudeau's past comments on that. No business case. Really? No business case? We're taking tens of millions of tons of it from the U.S. and Qatar. Canada's being left out. So that is certainly one productive development out of this European swing, is that there's been a shift in policy on LNG. We can say that for sure.
Yeah, I think that's significant. And I just want to disclose that I work with a German political foundation that's independent and does no government relations work either here or in Germany. But I would say the other thing that's really significant here is that, of course, the context has also changed. It's really important to remember that when Chancellor Scholz came in 2022 to meet with Prime Minister Trudeau and they put their focus on green hydrogen instead of LNG, there was no trade war with the U.S. There was no pressing need for us to really consider diversifying where we were sending our exports. And of course, we didn't even at that time have an operational LNG project going to Asia. Those things have all changed. And now the national conversation about the infrastructure that would be necessary to make LNG exports to Europe a possibility, like investments in the Port of Churchill, all of a sudden there is potentially a business case for that. So I think in complete fairness, things have shifted, but it's absolutely correct. There's a ton of interest in Germany, in Europe more broadly, in Canada's products, not just LNG, but also critical minerals. Yeah. And I think that, for the Canadian government, this is the smart kind of partnership. This is a good way to diversify our trade relationships. And these are the countries we want to be trading more with.
Michelle?
I would just add that, in addition to that, Europe is coming off of using Russian oil. And so they also have to be looking for new markets. And I think I should also just, say Prime Minister Trudeau's government was the one that actually granted the permits to allow for the LNG company off the West Coast to actually get into production. That very recently we sent our first shipments. It was one of the biggest projects that we worked on in BC with the Trudeau government, so I have to give them credit for that. It didn't go through under Stephen Harper, though I acknowledge, certainly Prime Minister Trudeau was did not see at that time any market in going to Europe. So,
Tim, what do you think is the next step here? I mean, we see Joly in Germany, we see Carney in Germany, we see Sidhu, the international trade minister in South America, trying to work on this deal with Mercosur. Can we broker some deals to make up for the lost U.S. business? I mean, I was looking at some of the export data, and it really has dropped a lot to the U.S. And yes, there's been an uptick to other markets, but it's not nearly as much as what we've lost to the Americans. Do you have any faith in this effort to expand our markets? Is it something we can actually do this time?
Yeah, but you're not going to put it on hyperspeed. You got to do the work. You got to do the legwork. And you got to have others believe you're prepared to be a partner. And we can't abandon the U.S. I mean, I think we do still have to accept the reality that relationship, regardless of the current challenges with the president, is our most important economic relationship. That's why it was fascinating to watch the Prime Minister change his language a little bit last week and talk about, we're only getting tariffed at 5.8%. Yeah. That's not a bad deal. We haven't heard anybody say ultimate free trade is the goal now. It's lower tariffs. And that may be the reality. And the Prime Minister is going to need to continue to explain to Canadians why, even if we do get stuck with tariffs, that's the case. Yep, we should be diversifying opportunities in Europe, but it's going to take us time. Maybe we see the first one. The submarines seem like a real live piece of economic opportunity. that may signal that some of the work that the Prime Minister and others are doing in Europe is working?
Quick final word to you, Jordan.
Well, I think what matters now is the follow-up on this. This isn't the first time there have been some really positive tentative agreements in Europe, but now we have to fill the gap with actually putting those into place. And that means using some of the unused capacity within CETA, and that means supporting Canadian businesses who want to export to Europe and making that easier for them too. So that's going to be a challenge for the government going forward, is to turn those agreements into actually delivering. And I think in particular politically, one of the biggest things is the concern that Canadians are having about the economy, about jobs, their community, connecting those two together, connecting what's happening overseas with actually improving people's conditions here at home. They have to do that this fall.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thanks so much to the Power Panel. Michelle Cadario, Tim Powers, and Jordan Likeness. Nice to see all you guys. Thanks for your smart thoughts.